Millionaire visits her black ex-husband after 10 years and surprises him with a gesture that changes everything. But what Victoria didn't know was that David had become the most dangerous person she could ever face. "You need to help me, David. I'm the only person who can save you now." Victoria Richardson stood there at the door of the law firm as if the last 10 years had never existed. Her white Bentley was parked outside, contrasting starkly with the modest neighborhood where David had built his life after she abandoned him. David Thompson, now 35, remained seated behind his simple desk, watching the woman who had destroyed his life. She was exactly as he remembered her, blonde, elegant, wearing that expensive perfume that cost more than most people's rent. But there was something different in her eyes. Panic. "Sitting down without being invited, as usual," David said calmly, without looking up from his documents. 10 years and you still think the world revolves around you." Victoria settled into the worn chair, clearly uncomfortable with the simplicity of the surroundings. "David, please, I need you to forget the past. My husband, Richard, was arrested yesterday for tax fraud. They're investigating all our businesses. I could lose everything." The irony was almost poetic. David remembered that day perfectly, 10 years ago, when Victoria had announced she was leaving him to marry Richard, the heir to Richardson Industries. "You have no future, David. You'll never be more than a neighborhood lawyer. Richard can give me the life I deserve." At the time, David was just starting out as a newly graduated lawyer, struggling to pay the bills for the small office he had rented in a basement. Victoria had met Richard at a high society party where she worked as a public relations officer, and within weeks she had decided that her 2-year marriage to David was a mistake of youth. "And why exactly do you think I would help you?" David asked, finally looking up. There was something in his gaze that made Victoria hesitate, a calmness that only exists in people who have faced the worst and come out stronger on the other side. "Because you're the only lawyer I know who can," she stopped, realizing how ridiculous it sounded. "David, I know I hurt you, but you've always been a good person. You're not like Richard. You have principles." David leaned back in his chair, a barely perceptible smile on his lips. All these years, he had imagined this moment. Victoria finally needing him, finally realizing she had made the wrong choice. But the reality was even more satisfying than any fantasy. "Principles," he repeated slowly. "Interesting how that word only comes up when you need something." Victoria's phone rang. She answered it quickly, her voice growing more desperate with every passing second. "No, Dad, I haven't been able to. Yes, I understand it's 50 million. I know Richard promised he would never." She hung up, her hands trembling slightly. David had watched everything in silence, like a predator studying its prey. He knew exactly what was going on. He had read about the Richardson case in the morning papers. What Victoria didn't know was that David was no longer the naive young lawyer she had abandoned. 50 million? David asked casually. "Did your family invest everything in Richard's company?" Victoria nodded, tears beginning to form. "My father put the entire family fortune up as collateral. If we can't prove Richard's innocence..." She couldn't finish the sentence. For a moment, David almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then he remembered the words Victoria had said the day she left him. "People like you never understand. There's a difference between dreaming of being someone in life and actually being someone in life." "And what exactly do you think I can do?" David asked, his voice maintaining that disturbing calm. "You specialize in financial crimes, don't you? I've heard you've won several impossible cases in recent years." Victoria leaned forward, desperate. "David, I can pay any amount. Anything you want." What she couldn't see was the file discreetly open in David's drawer, a complete dossier on Richard Richardson that he had been compiling for exactly 5 years. It had all started as morbid curiosity about the man who had stolen his wife, but it had become something much more elaborate when David discovered the true nature of Richard's business. If this story of revenge and justice has touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what Victoria was about to discover about the feudal man she had abandoned would turn her life into a nightmare she could never have imagined. "Any amount?" David repeated slowly, as if savoring each word. "Funny how money always appears when you need something." He stood up and walked to the small window overlooking the busy street. "I remember a similar conversation 10 years ago." Victoria followed his gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the memory. "David, that was a long time ago. We were young, I made mistakes. Mistakes. David laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Is that what you call that night? When you made me wait 3 hours at the restaurant while you were with him? Victoria's face paled. She had forgotten that David had found out about that particular night, the night she had lied about visiting her sick mother when she was actually at a luxury hotel with Richard, posting photos on Instagram of $1,000 champagne. Or maybe you're referring to the mistake of selling our wedding ring to buy the party dress where you met your new husband? David continued, his voice maintaining that unsettling calm. Oh no, wait. The biggest mistake was when you told your rich friends that I was just a phase you were getting over. Victoria closed her eyes. Each word was like a precise stab at wounds she thought had healed. David, please. Please what? Please forget that you publicly humiliated me? Please pretend I didn't hear you laughing with Richard about how I really thought I had a chance with a woman like you? David turned to face her directly. Or please ignore the fact that you took our dog Victoria, and gave it to Richard because street dogs don't belong in penthouses. Tears now streamed freely down Victoria's face. The mention of the dog was a low blow. Max had been the only living thing that truly connected them, and she had used him as yet another weapon to hurt him. I was young and stupid, she whispered. I thought status and money were all that mattered. Richard promised me the world. And he delivered, didn't he? David gestured toward the Bentley parked outside. For 10 years you had everything you wanted. A mansion in Beverly Hills, vacations in Europe, jewelry that costs more than most people earn in a decade. Victoria nodded miserably. But I wasn't happy, David. Not for a single day. That's too bad, David replied with a coldness that made her shiver. You know what I did the day after our divorce? I worked 18 hours straight. The next day, 19. For 6 months, I slept in this office because I couldn't afford rent and keep the business running. He opened a drawer and took out a faded photograph. It was himself, visibly thinner, sleeping on top of piles of legal documents in an old chair. My partner took this picture after I passed out from exhaustion. I lost 15 pounds in 2 months. I developed an ulcer from all the stress. David placed the photo on the table in front of Victoria. While you were posting pictures of $500 dinners, I had been eating instant noodles for 3 weeks. Victoria looked at the photograph and felt nauseous. In those first months after her marriage to Richard, she had truly lived like a princess, never thinking about what David was going through. But the funniest part, David continued, was when Richard started investigating my finances. Did you know that? Your new husband hired private investigators to find out if I posed any threat to the family business. What are you talking about? Victoria asked, genuinely surprised. David smiled for the first time, but it was a smile that would give you nightmares. Did Richard ever tell you that during the first 2 years of your marriage, he was paranoid that I might use privileged information you had shared with me to harm his business? Victoria shook her head, confused. He even paid a bribe to a judge to try to disbar me from the Bar Association. False allegations of unethical conduct. I spent 8 months fighting to keep my license while you two were honeymooning in the Caribbean. The revelation hit Victoria like a slap in the face. Richard had never mentioned anything about it. All these years, she had thought David had simply moved on with his life, perhaps even relieved to be rid of her. Richard tried to destroy me professionally, David continued, his voice taking on a dangerous intensity, but what he didn't know was that every attack only made me more determined. Every attempt to hurt me taught me something new about how the system really works. Victoria's phone rang again. This time she ignored it. Aren't you going to answer it? David asked with feigned concern. I bet it's your father, asking if you found a magic solution for the 50 million Richard lost in fraudulent schemes. Victoria looked at him with a sudden look of understanding. How do you know the specific details about Richard's arrest? The newspapers only mentioned tax fraud. David sat back down, folding his fingers on the table. Because, my dear ex-wife, I know exactly what kind of fraud Richard committed. I know the name of every shell company he created. I know about every offshore account, every forged document. That's impossible, Victoria whispered. It's impossible for the failed lawyer you abandoned 10 years ago, David agreed. But it's not impossible for the man he's become. Victoria looked around the simple office, trying to reconcile the modesty of the surroundings with the absolute confidence David was displaying. Something didn't fit, something she was missing. David, I don't understand. Of course you don't, he interrupted. Because you still see me as that naive young man who cried when you left him. You still think you're dealing with someone desperate for your approval. At that moment, the office door opened and an elegant African-American woman entered, wearing an impeccable suit that cost more than Victoria's car. David, sorry to interrupt, she said, but the senator called. He wants to confirm that you'll be at tomorrow's meeting on judicial reform. Victoria watched the interaction, confused. What senator? What judicial reform? Of course, Patricia. Confirm that I'll be there. David turned to Victoria. Patricia, this is Victoria Richardson. Victoria, Patricia is my partner in the firm. Firm? Victoria thought David worked alone in that small office. Patricia extended her hand politely. Pleased to meet you, Ms. Richardson. I must say it's ironic to meet you here, considering the work we've done over the past few years. What work? Victoria asked, shaking the woman's hand. Patricia looked at David, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Well, Patricia said with a professional smile. Our firm specializes in cases against companies that commit large-scale tax fraud. Richardson Industries has been one of our targets of investigation for quite some time. Victoria's world stopped. What do you mean, target of investigation? What Patricia is trying to say politely, David explained calmly, is that I've spent the last 5 years building the case against your husband. Every document the FBI found yesterday, I provided it. Victoria stood up abruptly, the chair falling backward. You had Richard arrested. I had justice served, David corrected. Richard is guilty of every crime he was arrested for. I just made sure the authorities had the necessary evidence. The realization hit Victoria with devastating force. She hadn't sought out David by chance. She hadn't thought of him as a last resort out of desperation. David had orchestrated everything so that she would end up exactly where she was now, begging for help from the man she had destroyed, who was now destroying her life in return. My God, she whispered. You planned all of this. What Victoria didn't yet know was that Richard's arrest was only the first move in a much more complex game, and that the quiet man she had underestimated for so long was about to show her that 10 years of humiliation could turn a broken heart into the most dangerous strategist she could ever imagine facing. 5 years, David repeated, walking over to a picture on the wall, a framed photograph of him receiving an award. Victoria looked closer and felt her stomach sink. It was the Federal Department of Justice's award for excellence in criminal law. 5 years since I decided Richard Richardson needed to pay for every life he destroyed with his schemes. David turned the frame over, revealing a second award behind it. 3 years since I became a special advisor to the FBI for corporate financial crimes. Patricia opened a folder and spread documents across the table. Victoria, your husband didn't just commit tax fraud. He embezzled retirement funds from 847 employees, falsified environmental reports that caused contamination in 2 cities, and bribed federal officials to cover up deaths at his factories. Victoria stared at the documents as if they were poisonous snakes. That can't be true. Richard said the company's problems were just bureaucratic issues. Richard said a lot of things, David interrupted. Like when he said you had finally updated your life by marrying him. Or when he toasted at your wedding, saying he had saved a woman from wasting her life with inferior people. Victoria's face fell. She didn't know David had overheard that conversation. Or maybe you prefer the version where he told investors that your previous divorce was a youthful mistake with a third-rate lawyer. David smiled coldly. I have it all recorded, of course. At that moment, Victoria's phone rang. It was Richard, calling from prison. She looked at David, silently asking for permission to answer. He nodded magnanimously. Richard? Where are you? What's going on? Victoria spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Victoria, listen carefully. This whole thing is temporary. My lawyers will sort it out in a few hours. You didn't say anything compromising to anyone, did you? Richard's arrogant voice echoed through the speaker that David had discreetly activated. Richard, I'm with, Victoria began, but he interrupted her. I don't care who you're with. Just don't do anything stupid. And Victoria? Maybe it's time to sell some jewelry and take money from your personal account. I need 200,000 for bail. David signaled for Victoria to continue the conversation. Richard, I need to tell you something. I'm at David's office, my ex-husband. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then Richard burst out laughing. That loser? Victoria, have you lost your mind? What can that nobody do for us? He can barely pay his own rent. Richard laughed louder. Let me guess, he offered to help for free because he's still in love with you? David approached the phone. Hello, Richard. It's been a while since we last spoke. Richard's tone changed instantly. David? What are you doing there? Talking to my ex-wife about how I can help her through this difficult time, David replied calmly. Look here, little lawyer, Richard said, returning to his arrogance. I don't know what little game you're trying to play, but this is too big for you. We're talking about Richardson Industries, not your little neighborhood cases. Little neighborhood cases? David repeated, looking at Patricia with amusement. Interesting. Patricia, can you show Victoria the file on the little cases we've won recently? Patricia opened another file. Petromax Corporation lawsuit, $340 million in damages. Williams versus Southern Chemical Industries, $180 million. Class action lawsuit against. Enough, Victoria whispered, interrupting the list. On the other end of the line, Richard had fallen silent. Finally he spoke, his voice laden with growing suspicion. David, what exactly do you want? Justice, David replied simply. Something you've stolen from many people over the years, including my ex-wife. What do you mean, stolen from her? Richard asked. David looked directly at Victoria. You never told him about the baby, did you, Victoria? The world stopped. Victoria turned completely pale, her hands began to shake. Patricia looked surprised between the two. What baby? Richard shouted into the phone. Victoria! What baby? Victoria opened her mouth, but no sound came out. David continued relentlessly. The baby Victoria was expecting when she left me to marry you, Richard. The baby she lost 3 weeks after the wedding due to the stress and pressure you put on her to be the perfect wife. That's a lie, Richard stammered, but his voice had lost all authority. Victoria spent 2 weeks in the hospital while you were on a business trip in Europe. She tried to tell you when you got back, but you said you didn't want domestic drama getting in the way of the company's expansion. David approached Victoria, who was now crying silently. Victoria never forgave herself for choosing social status over a real family. And you, Richard, never knew that you destroyed her only chance to be a mother. The silence on the phone line was absolute. Finally, Richard's voice came out as a whisper, Victoria, is this true? Victoria could barely nod, even though she knew he couldn't see her. That's why, David continued, when I decided to finish you off, it wasn't just personal revenge. It was justice for every person you destroyed over the years, including the woman I loved, whom you turned into a shadow of her former self. David walked over to a drawer and took out another file, thicker than the previous ones. Richard, do you remember Marcus Williams? The black engineer who tried to report safety issues at your chemical plant 3 years ago. How do you? Marcus was fired, professionally defamed, and his family received threats until they left town, David continued. What you didn't know was that Marcus was Patricia's cousin. And when he came to me for a labor lawsuit, we started investigating you much more deeply. Patricia picked up a photo from the table. Marcus died last year, Richard. Cancer caused by exposure to chemicals that you knew were dangerous and decided to hide so as not to hurt profits. You can't prove. We can prove everything, David interrupted him. 3 years of investigation, Richard. 3 years collecting evidence, testimony, documents. We have recordings of you approving illegal dumping. We have emails where you order medical reports to be hidden. We have bank records of every bribe you paid. Victoria raised her head, looking at David with a mixture of terror and admiration. You planned all this. Every move, David confirmed. Every step Richard has taken in the last 3 years has been anticipated and documented. Even this conversation is being recorded and broadcast live to federal investigators. A sound of panic came from the phone. Richard had obviously dropped the device. When he picked it up again, His voice was completely different. David, listen, we can talk, we can make a deal. The only deal, David said calmly, is for you to take full responsibility for all the crimes you've committed and accept a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Never. Then I'll see you in court, Richard. Oh, and Richard? One last thing. What? David smiled for the first time with genuine joy. Remember that young lawyer with no future that Victoria left 10 years ago? He's become the man who will destroy your empire and prove that true greatness has never had anything to do with a silver spoon or an important surname. The call ended abruptly. Victoria looked at David as if she were seeing a stranger. My God, she whispered. Who have you become? David calmly put the documents away. I've become exactly the person you said I would never be, Victoria. I've become someone Richard Richardson would fear to face. But while Victoria tried to process the magnitude of the transformation of the man she had underestimated for so long, she had no idea that David's true revenge was just beginning, and that in the coming days she would discover that losing $50 million would be the least of her problems compared to what David had really planned to destroy not only Richard, but the entire corrupt system that had allowed men like him to thrive by trampling on people like the idealistic young lawyer she had abandoned. David, Victoria whispered, still processing the magnitude of what she had discovered. You really did all this for revenge? Not for revenge, David corrected, walking over to a TV screen mounted on the wall. For justice. There's a fundamental difference. He turned on the television, tuning in to a news channel. The screen showed helicopters flying over Richard's mansion, while federal agents carried boxes of evidence. Live broadcast, Patricia explained. The search and seizure warrant was executed 20 minutes ago. It's being broadcast in real time to every station in the country. Victoria watched, mesmerized, as the anchor narrated, a coordinated operation that exposed a corruption scheme involving at least 15 public officials, resulting in the largest seizure of assets for financial crimes in the state's history. David's phone rang. He answered it calmly, putting it on speakerphone. David? David, get me out of here. It was Richard, clearly panicked. They're taking everything. My house, my cars, even Victoria's jewelry. Calm down, Richard, David replied with feigned concern. Tell me exactly what's going on. They have recordings. Recordings of conversations I had years ago. How is that possible? Richard shouted, his voice echoing through what sounded like a cell. David looked directly at Victoria. Remember the renovation you did in Richard's office 3 years ago? When he complained that the work was taking longer than expected. Victoria nodded slowly, a terrible realization dawning on her. Patricia coordinated that renovation, David continued. Our people installed audio devices in strategic locations. 3 years of recording every criminal conversation, every planned bribe, every threat made. My God, Victoria murmured. On the phone, Richard continued, Victoria. Victoria, are you there? I need you to come visit me. I need to explain some things to you before it's too late. What kind of things? David asked innocently. Not with you listening. Richard exploded. Victoria, there are accounts you don't know about. Accounts with money that doesn't appear in official documents. If you don't withdraw that money today, the feds will find everything. Victoria turned pale. Richard, what accounts? What money are you talking about? The 15 million in the Cayman Islands. The 8 million in Panama. Victoria, that money is in your name. If the feds find it, you'll be arrested as an accomplice. The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria looked at David with an expression of pure terror. You didn't know about the money, did you? David asked softly. Victoria shook her head, unable to speak. Richard used your personal information to open offshore accounts, Patricia explained clinically. Standard technique for money laundering. If he got caught, you would take the blame too. From the phone came a groan of despair from Richard. Victoria, you have to understand. It was to protect us. It was a safety plan. Safety. Victoria finally found her voice. You put $23 million of dirty money in my name without my knowledge? It was temporary. I was going to transfer it all back once the investigations were over. David approached the phone. Richard, how long have you been planning this safety net? That's none of your business. Actually, it is. David opened another file. Because we found out that you started transferring money to accounts in Victoria's name 3 days after your wedding. 10 years of using your own wife as a front. Victoria stood up abruptly and began pacing. 10 years. For 10 years I was your unwitting accomplice. Victoria, listen. Richard tried one last time. You need to leave the country today. Take the money from the accounts and go somewhere without extradition. And abandon my father? My family? Victoria asked incredulously. Your family has already lost everything. Your father's 50 million was used as collateral for operations that I knew were illegal. There is nothing left to save. The entire confession had been recorded. Patricia made a discreet gesture and David nodded. Richard, David said calmly, you just confessed on a recorded call that you knowingly used Victoria's family's money for illegal operations, knowing that they would lose everything. The silence on the other end of the line lasted for several long seconds. When Richard spoke again, his voice was completely different. You recorded this conversation. I did. And you're going to use it against me. I already have. The recording was automatically sent to the FBI, federal prosecutors, and 3 different television stations. Victoria sat down heavily, covering her face with her hands. David, Richard said, his voice now a defeated whisper. Why? Why all this? David approached Victoria, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. Because, Richard, you didn't just destroy my life when you stole Victoria. You destroyed the lives of hundreds of people. Employees who lost their pensions, families who lost their homes, entire communities poisoned by your chemicals. He paused, looking at Victoria with a tenderness she hadn't seen in years. And because Victoria deserved to know the truth about the man she was married to. She deserved the chance to choose a different life before it was too late. From the phone came the sound of Richard crying, deep sobs from a man who finally understood that he had lost everything. My company, he murmured. My reputation. My fortune. Your freedom, David added. Don't forget your freedom. Based on the evidence we've gathered, you're looking at 25 to 30 years in prison. Victoria raised her head, looking at David with a mixture of admiration and terror. What about me? What happens to me now? David smiled for the first time with genuine kindness. Patricia has already prepared your defense. You are a victim, not an accomplice. We will prove that Richard forged your signature and used your data without your knowledge. But my father, the 50 million. It will be recovered, Patricia interrupted, at least in part. Richard's seized assets will be sold, and the victims, including your family, will receive reparations. Richard had stopped crying, his voice now laden with a last spark of venom. David, you may have defeated me, but Victoria will never forgive you for destroying her life too. David looked directly at Victoria. I didn't destroy her life, Richard. I saved her from wasting the rest of her life with a criminal. Victoria was silent for a long moment, processing everything she had discovered. Finally, she spoke. Richard, 10 years ago you told me that David would never amount to anything in life. That I deserved better than a third-rate lawyer. Victoria. Today I discovered that this third-rate lawyer has become the most honest man I have ever known, while you became a criminal who used my own identity to launder dirty money. The call ended abruptly. Richard had hung up, but the silence that followed was filled with the sound of the television, where reporters continued to narrate the fall of the Richardson empire. Victoria looked at David with tears in her eyes, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of despair. You really did all this, she said, to protect me too? David nodded silently. Even after everything I put you through? Especially after everything you went through, he corrected gently. As the news showed Richard being transferred to a maximum security prison and the Richardson family's assets being catalogued for auction, Victoria finally understood that the man she had abandoned for considering him without a future had become exactly the kind of person she always said she wanted by her side. Someone with enough power to protect her, intelligence to win any battle, and above all, integrity to do it all for the right reasons. But the question that echoed in the air as they watched justice finally being served was simple and devastating. Was it possible to rebuild a love on the wreckage of so much lost time and so many wrong choices? 2 years later, David was in the same courtroom where Richard had been sentenced to 28 years in prison. This time, as a special advisor to the Department of Justice, he was presenting reforms to the legal system. Real change begins when we stop accepting injustice as normal, he told the packed audience. In the front row, Victoria watched him with admiration. They had slowly reconciled, building something new on solid foundations. She now ran an NGO that helped victims of financial crimes. David's phone rang, a message from prison. Richard begged for forgiveness for the 1,000th time, saying he finally understood the harm he had caused. David showed the message to Victoria. "What do you think?" "I think some people only learn when they lose everything," she replied. "But we've learned that the best revenge is to build something bigger than our enemies could ever destroy." They left the courthouse hand in hand. David had proven that true greatness does not come from birth or money, but from character and determination. Not only was justice served, it inspired others to never give up fighting for what is right. If this story of transformation and justice touched you, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that those who underestimate the strength of a determined heart always pay the price for their own arrogance.